My daughter-in-law says I wanted her gone. Someone whispered behind me as I stood outside the ballroom doors. And in that
How could
instant,
you
I
do this to
realized she had
us?
already
Mom,
won the
please,
room
let's
before I
just
had
talk.
spoken a
Talk after
single
what
word.
she's done.
Then I heard applause.
This
Not for me,
clause here is
for the
crucial
woman
for
who
the
had
asset
just
division.
convinced
I see.
everyone
And
that
the
I was the villain
implications?
in my
It
own
strengthens
family.
your
I
position.
reached for
The
the
market
door,
shift
but my
demands our
hand
immediate
stopped when I heard
focus.
my own
How does
son
this
say
affect our
words I never
strategy?
imagined I
We
would
must
hear.
adapt.
Mom,
The new
please
evidence
leave.
changes
I
everything.
didn't argue.
How does it
I didn't
affect our
cry. I
strategy?
simply
We need
looked
to
at the
file an
polished
immediate
brass
motion.
handle, wondering how
Grandma,
many
are the
lives it
roses
took to
happy?
erase 40
Yes,
years
dear,
of
they're growing
sacrifice.
strong, just like
What
you.
none
love
of them
this.
knew was that the building they were standing in, the company they were celebrating, and even the microphone my daughter-in-law had used to destroy my reputation were all connected to one secret she had never bothered to uncover. By the time the sun came up the next morning, someone in that room would lose everything they believed already belonged to them. I am Eleanor Whitmore, 68 years old, a widow, a mother, and until that evening, I believe my family still recognized the difference between kindness and weakness. My late husband, Henry, built Whitmore Construction from a single pickup truck and a toolbox, and together we spent 4 decades turning it into one of the most respected family-owned companies along the South Carolina coast. After Henry passed away 11 months earlier, I stayed out of the spotlight. Daniel, my only son, became the public face of the company while I quietly handled board matters and long-term planning from my office. That arrangement suited me just fine because I had never cared about applause. I cared about stability. I cared about keeping promises. Most of all, I cared about keeping my family together, even when I could already feel invisible cracks spreading beneath the surface. Vanessa had entered our lives 10 years earlier with a bright smile, impeccable manners, and an effortless ability to make everyone feel important. Friends described her as charming. Employees admired her confidence. Even I believed Daniel had found the perfect partner. Looking back now, I realize manipulation rarely arrives wearing an obvious disguise. Sometimes it carries flowers to Sunday dinner, remembers birthdays, sends thoughtful thank you cards, and patiently waits until everyone trusts it completely. After Henry's funeral, Vanessa insisted on helping me with everything. She offered to organize my appointments, answer phone calls while I rested, and sort through paperwork that she said looked overwhelming. I thanked her more times than I can remember. It felt comforting to have family close during the loneliest season of my life. Daniel agreed that having them move into the guest house on the property would be good for everyone. "You'll never have to feel alone again, Mom," he promised. I believed him because he was still the little boy I remembered chasing fireflies across our backyard every July. At least that was who I wanted to believe he still was. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala had always been Henry's favorite evening of the year. It funded trade scholarships for young people entering the construction industry, and after his passing, I refused to cancel it. I wanted the event to honor his memory, not our grief. The ballroom sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Fresh white roses lined every table. Old friends greeted one another with warm embraces, while a jazz quartet played softly near the stage. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe the hardest months were finally behind us. Then Vanessa asked if she could say a few words before dinner. I smiled and nodded without the slightest suspicion that the speech she was about to give had never been written to celebrate my husband's legacy. It had been written to bury mine. Vanessa walked toward the stage with effortless confidence, smoothing the front of her ivory dress as though she were preparing to accept an award instead of delivering a surprise speech. She smiled at every familiar face in the ballroom, thanked the donors for supporting the foundation, and spoke warmly about my late husband. There was nothing unusual about her tone at first. In fact, it was so gracious that I remember feeling proud of the woman my son had married. Then her voice softened, and she paused just long enough for every conversation in the room to disappear. She said that grief had changed families in ways no one expected. She said that loss sometimes revealed hidden pain. Then she looked directly at me with tears gathering in her eyes, and the room became so quiet that I could hear glasses being placed gently onto linen-covered tables. She explained that the past year had been difficult because she had tried her best to keep our family together while living under constant emotional pressure. She never shouted. She never accused me with dramatic language. Instead, she carefully wrapped every sentence in concern, making herself sound compassionate while allowing everyone else to reach the conclusion she wanted. She said she had spent months wondering whether she truly belonged in the family. She admitted she had considered leaving more than once because she believed she would never be accepted. Every sentence was designed to sound vulnerable instead of calculated. That was what made it so effective. I slowly turned my head toward Daniel, expecting confusion on his face. Instead, I saw sympathy. He had already heard this version of our family story before that evening. He did not look surprised. He looked prepared. Around the room, I noticed familiar expressions changing one by one. Longtime business partners who had shared holidays with us avoided my eyes. Friends who had known me for decades folded their hands together with uncomfortable silence. A woman I had volunteered beside for nearly 15 years reached across the table and gently squeezed Vanessa's hand. In less than 2 minutes, decades of quiet integrity had been overshadowed by a carefully rehearsed performance. Vanessa continued by describing small moments that had actually happened, but twisting each one just enough to change its meaning. A canceled dinner became evidence that I wanted to exclude her. A disagreement over financial paperwork became proof that I never trusted her. My request to delay renovations on the guest house until after foundation season somehow became another example of my controlling behavior. Every story contained a tiny piece of truth surrounded by layers of carefully arranged fiction. That was why they sounded believable. The most dangerous lies usually borrow the face of reality. Finally, Vanessa lowered her eyes and whispered that she had spent months feeling as though she was quietly being pushed out of the family she loved. Several people nodded with genuine compassion. Someone near the front quietly applauded. Others followed until the entire ballroom echoed with supportive applause directed toward my daughter-in-law. Then Daniel stepped beside her, placed one reassuring hand across her shoulder, and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not anger alone. It was disappointment shaped by complete certainty. Before I could say a single word, he took a slow breath and asked me, in front of every employee, donor, and lifelong friend, if I would leave the event because remaining there would only make the evening more painful for everyone else. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The applause faded into an uneasy silence that somehow felt even louder than the clapping had been. I looked at Daniel, searching his face for even the smallest sign that he expected me to defend myself, but all I found was quiet determination. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. That realization hurt more than every accusation I had just heard. I slowly picked up my evening purse from the chair beside me and offered a polite smile to the guests nearest my table. I thanked them for coming, wished them a pleasant evening, and walked toward the ballroom entrance without raising my voice or protesting a single word. Behind me, I could hear whispers beginning to spread across the room like a cold breeze. Some people sounded sympathetic. Others sounded relieved. A few simply sounded curious. Rumors have always traveled faster than truth, especially when they arrive wrapped in emotion. As I reached the large wooden doors, 2 security employees standing nearby looked uncertain. They had known me for years. One of them had started working at Whitmore Construction almost 2 decades earlier. He lowered his eyes as though embarrassed to even be standing there. I gave him a reassuring nod before opening the door myself. No one escorted me out. No one needed to. I left with the same quiet dignity that Henry had always taught me to carry, especially on the days when life became unfair. The warm spring air outside felt strangely peaceful compared to the tension inside the ballroom. I stood on the front steps for a moment, listening to the distant sound of laughter drifting through the closed doors. Less than 5 minutes earlier, I had been preparing to honor my husband's memory. Now I had become the uninvited guest at my own foundation event. I should have felt angry. Instead, I felt something much colder. Pieces of conversations from the previous several months suddenly began fitting together with uncomfortable precision. Vanessa insisting on managing my appointments. Vanessa encouraging Daniel to handle more legal paperwork without involving me. Vanessa gently suggesting that perhaps I was working too hard for someone my age. At the time, every comment had sounded thoughtful. Looking back, they resembled careful steps in a much longer plan. I unlocked my car, placed my purse on the passenger seat, but I did not start the engine. Instead, I sat quietly with both hands resting on the steering wheel while memories continued arranging themselves into a pattern I could no longer ignore. 3 months earlier, I had arrived at my attorney's office only to discover that my scheduled meeting had been mysteriously canceled. The receptionist apologized, explaining that someone claiming to represent my family had called to reschedule. I had assumed it was an honest misunderstanding. 2 weeks after that, a follow-up appointment with my cardiologist disappeared from my calendar without explanation. Again, I dismissed it as a simple mistake. Then there were the unopened letters that Vanessa always insisted on organizing before placing them on my desk. She said she was only trying to make my life easier. I believed her because trust had always been my first instinct, not suspicion. As those memories settled into place, my cellular phone vibrated. The screen displayed only one name: Grace. My 16-year-old granddaughter rarely called during family events. I answered immediately. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Grandma, please do not go home yet. There is something you need to know. I think Mom has been hiding something from all of us." In that single sentence, the first real crack finally appeared in the perfect story Vanessa had spent months building. Grace asked me to meet her at the small public garden 3 blocks away instead of coming back to the house. Her voice carried a nervous urgency that I had never heard before, and although she tried to sound calm, I could tell she was looking over her shoulder while she spoke. I drove there without asking questions. When I arrived, she was already sitting on a wooden bench beneath an old oak tree, still wearing the blue dress she had chosen for the gala. The moment she saw my car, she stood up quickly and hurried toward me. She climbed into the passenger seat, closed the door, and remained silent for several seconds. Her hands were trembling. Finally, she whispered that she was sorry. I reached over and gently held her hand, telling her she had nothing to apologize for. She looked directly into my eyes before admitting that she had overheard a conversation several weeks earlier that had never made sense until tonight. One evening, she had come downstairs looking for a glass of water when she heard her mother talking on the telephone inside the study. Vanessa believed everyone else was asleep. Grace remembered hearing her mother laugh softly before saying, "Once the paperwork is approved, she will not be making any more decisions." At the time, Grace assumed they were discussing ordinary business matters. Then she heard another sentence that stayed in her memory. Vanessa said there would be no reason to worry because Daniel was finally beginning to understand that everything would be easier once his mother stepped aside. Grace told me she wanted to believe she had misunderstood, so she never mentioned it. As the weeks passed, more strange moments began piling up. She noticed envelopes arriving from medical offices that disappeared before I ever opened them. She watched her mother answer my cellular telephone and quietly tell callers that I was resting even when I was sitting outside reading. She saw appointments vanish from the family calendar after Vanessa insisted on organizing everyone's schedules. None of those moments seemed important by themselves, but together they formed a picture that frightened her. Then, only 2 days before the gala, Grace accidentally walked into the kitchen while her parents were speaking in low voices. Daniel sounded uncertain. He asked whether everything had gone too far. Vanessa calmly replied that people always believe the younger person when an older family member appeared confused, especially after losing a spouse. Grace said my heart sank when I heard those words because they confirmed something I had refused to consider. Someone was carefully creating the appearance that I could no longer manage my own affairs. Even more painful was realizing my son had listened instead of walking away. I asked Grace whether she had told anyone else. She slowly shook her head. Tears filled her eyes as she admitted she had been afraid of destroying her family. I gently reminded her that truth does not destroy families. Deception does. Before she left the car, she reached into her handbag and handed me a small folded piece of paper. It was a reminder card from a medical evaluation that I had never scheduled, bearing my name, my date of birth, and an appointment for the following Monday with a physician I had never met. Someone had been making plans for my future without ever asking for my permission. I waited until Grace safely returned to the gala before I drove home. The guest house lights were still glowing in the distance, and for the first time since Daniel and Vanessa had moved onto the property, I did not see it as a symbol of family. I saw it as a place where quiet decisions had been made without me. Still, I refused to let fear make my choices. Henry used to tell me that panic clouds judgment, but patience reveals patterns. That night, I decided to stop reacting and start observing. The following morning, I behaved exactly as I always had. I greeted Daniel with a warm smile when he came into the kitchen, asked whether he wanted more coffee, and thanked Vanessa for helping clean up after the gala. If either of them expected anger or confrontation, they were disappointed. Vanessa studied my face carefully, almost as if she were trying to determine whether I had learned something. I gave her nothing to read. After breakfast, she casually mentioned that she had scheduled another appointment for me the following week because it was important to stay proactive about my health. I smiled and thanked her for thinking of me. I never mentioned the reminder card Grace had given me. Instead, I quietly slipped it into the inside pocket of my handbag. Later that afternoon, while Vanessa drove into town for errands and Daniel returned to the office, I called the physician listed on the appointment card. The receptionist politely confirmed that a cognitive evaluation had been arranged in my name several weeks earlier. She also explained that someone identifying herself as a close family member had expressed concerns about memory loss and declining judgment. My hands remained steady as I thanked her for the information. I canceled nothing. I simply asked for copies of every document associated with the appointment, including the referral request. The receptionist agreed to prepare everything for me. That single conversation confirmed what had once been only suspicion. Someone had begun creating an official record that questioned my ability to manage my own affairs. I then called Thomas Reed, the attorney who had represented Henry and me for more than 30 years. His assistant immediately offered me an appointment that same afternoon. When I arrived, Thomas listened without interrupting while I carefully described the gala, Grace's concerns, the canceled appointments, and the unexpected medical evaluation. He folded his hands across the desk and remained silent for several moments before opening a thick file bearing my family's name. He reminded me that Henry had always believed important decisions should be supported by facts rather than emotion. Then he asked a question that changed the direction of everything. Eleanor, before we assume what they are planning, let us determine what legal steps have already been taken. Those words settled my thoughts immediately. We were no longer dealing with hurt feelings or misunderstandings. We were dealing with documents, records, timelines, and evidence. Thomas promised to begin reviewing every recent filing connected to my estate, my company interests, and my personal affairs. As I stood to leave, he looked at me with the same calm confidence he had carried for decades and said, "Until we know exactly what we are facing, tell no one that you have become suspicious." Sometimes the safest place to observe the truth is from behind the appearance of complete trust. I walked back to my car understanding that my greatest advantage was no longer the family name I carried. It was the simple fact that Vanessa still believed I had not noticed the game she had already begun. The next several days unfolded with an almost unsettling sense of normalcy, and that was exactly what I wanted. Every morning, I followed the same routine I had followed for years. I watered the flowers on the back patio, read the local newspaper with my coffee, and greeted Daniel and Vanessa with the same quiet kindness they had come to expect from me. I noticed that Vanessa watched me more carefully than before. Every smile she offered seemed measured. Every question carried an invisible purpose. She asked whether I had remembered to pay a utility bill. She casually wondered if I still knew the password to one of my investment accounts. She even suggested that perhaps I should allow Daniel to begin handling more of my financial responsibilities because, in her words, "You deserve to enjoy retirement without unnecessary stress." I thanked her for her concern and told her I would think about it. Nothing in my voice revealed that Thomas had already begun uncovering details neither of us had expected. 2 days later, he called and asked me to come to his office immediately. When I arrived, several folders were spread neatly across the conference table. Thomas pointed to the first document. It was a formal inquiry requesting information related to my legal capacity to manage certain assets. The request had not been approved, but someone had already begun asking questions that could eventually support a petition for financial guardianship. My name appeared throughout the paperwork, yet I had never seen any of it before. Then he handed me another document. It showed that an authorization request had been drafted allowing someone else to communicate with financial institutions on my behalf if my judgment were ever questioned. The signatures had not yet been completed, but the preparation alone revealed careful planning. Thomas remained calm as he explained that none of these documents transferred authority by themselves. However, they established a foundation that could become very dangerous if supported by medical opinions or convincing testimony from close family members. I immediately understood why the mysterious medical evaluation had been scheduled. It was never about my health. It was about creating a record that could later justify taking control of my decisions. I asked Thomas whether Daniel's name appeared anywhere in the files. He hesitated before answering. Finally, He slid one last page toward me. Daniel had attended an informational meeting with the attorney who prepared the preliminary paperwork. His signature did not authorize any action, but it confirmed he had been present during discussions about my future. I stared at the page for several long moments. I had hoped he was simply being misled by his wife. Instead, I now knew he had listened to conversations that questioned my independence and never once warned me. That quiet realization settled deeper than anger. It felt like mourning someone who was still alive. Thomas gently reminded me that assumptions were no longer necessary because facts were beginning to replace them. He advised me not to confront either Daniel or Vanessa. Instead, he recommended updating every security measure connected to my personal records, reviewing corporate governance documents, and allowing those who underestimated me to continue believing they were several steps ahead. As I drove home that afternoon, I no longer wondered whether I was imagining things. The uncertainty had disappeared. In its place came something far more powerful: clarity. And with clarity came patience, because I finally understood that the strongest response was not proving I was right. It was allowing every carefully hidden decision to reveal itself before anyone realized I had already begun preparing for the day the truth would have to stand on its own. When people believe they have already won, they usually become less careful. That was exactly what Thomas expected, and over the following week, I watched it happen one small moment at a time. Vanessa no longer hid her confidence. She began speaking about future renovations to the main house as though the decisions already belonged to her. She casually suggested replacing Henry's study with a larger sitting room because, as she put it, nobody really uses that old space anymore. I simply smiled and asked whether she preferred cream-colored walls or soft gray. She answered without hesitation, never realizing that I had no intention of changing a single inch of the room my husband had loved. Daniel also seemed different. Instead of asking my opinion before making company decisions, he informed me after meetings had already taken place. He assured me that he was only trying to reduce my workload, and perhaps part of him even believed those words. But every conversation carried the same quiet message. They were preparing for a future in which my approval would become unnecessary. One afternoon, Vanessa mentioned that the physician's office had called to confirm my appointment for the following Monday. She looked almost disappointed when I calmly replied that I intended to keep it. In reality, Thomas had already contacted an independent geriatric specialist with an outstanding professional reputation. He advised me that if anyone ever questioned my mental capacity, the strongest answer would not come from arguments inside the family. It would come from objective medical evidence gathered by someone with no personal interest in the outcome. I attended both appointments exactly as scheduled. The first physician, whose evaluation had been arranged without my knowledge, appeared surprised that I arrived carrying a folder containing my own financial records, board meeting notes, and a detailed timeline of my daily responsibilities. We spoke for nearly an hour. By the end of the examination, he smiled warmly and said there was nothing in my presentation suggesting impaired judgment or significant cognitive decline. 2 days later, the independent specialist reached the same conclusion after conducting an even more comprehensive evaluation. Thomas quietly placed both reports into a growing file that was becoming stronger with every passing day. Meanwhile, another unexpected piece of the puzzle arrived through Grace. She knocked softly on my kitchen door one Saturday morning while her parents were away shopping. She carried a tablet computer against her chest and looked conflicted. She explained that she had borrowed it from the family office because she wanted to finish a school project, but an email notification had appeared on the screen before she could log out. She had not gone looking for private information, yet one subject line caught her attention because it included my name. She photographed the screen before returning the device exactly as she had found it. The picture showed an email from an outside attorney thanking Vanessa and Daniel for discussing the next phase once supporting medical documentation became available. There were no illegal instructions, no dramatic confessions, only a carefully written message that assumed additional steps would soon follow. Sometimes the smallest documents reveal the largest intentions. I thanked Grace for trusting me and reminded her never to search through anyone's belongings again. The truth we already possessed was enough. As I placed the photograph beside the medical reports and the legal paperwork inside Thomas's file, I realized something important. We were no longer collecting suspicions. We were assembling a timeline. and timelines have a remarkable way of exposing stories that people believed would remain hidden forever. On Monday morning, I asked Daniel to join me for breakfast before he left for the office. It was something I had done countless times over the years, and he accepted without hesitation. Vanessa arrived a few minutes later carrying a plate of fresh biscuits, smiling with the same effortless confidence that had become so familiar. I poured coffee for all three of us and spoke about ordinary things. The weather, a new community scholarship, the garden that Henry had always insisted needed more roses. I wanted them to believe nothing had changed. Halfway through breakfast, I quietly mentioned that Thomas Reed had recommended reviewing my estate plan since it had been almost a year since Henry passed away. Vanessa immediately leaned forward with an expression of practiced concern. She said that updating legal documents was a wise decision because families should never wait until a crisis forced difficult choices. Daniel nodded in agreement and added that he would gladly attend any meeting if I wanted support. I smiled warmly and thanked them both before explaining that Thomas preferred to meet with the entire immediate family later that week. I watched Vanessa carefully over the rim of my coffee cup. There it was. Just for a fraction of a second, satisfaction crossed her face before she replaced it with polite sympathy. She believed the meeting would finally move her plans forward. Exactly as Thomas predicted, confidence had begun replacing caution. 2 days later, Thomas telephoned to confirm that the conference room at his office had been reserved for Friday morning. He asked me only one question. "Are you prepared to remain calm no matter what is said?" I answered without hesitation that I was. Anger would only distract from the facts, and facts were finally on our side. During the days leading up to the meeting, additional pieces quietly fell into place. The independent medical specialist completed a formal report stating that I demonstrated sound judgment, intact memory, and full capacity to manage both personal and financial affairs. Thomas also received certified copies of the preliminary guardianship inquiries that had been initiated weeks earlier. Nothing had yet been filed with the court, but the sequence of documents established a clear timeline that matched Grace's observations almost perfectly. Even more significant, the physician whose appointment had originally been arranged without my knowledge provided written confirmation that I had arrived fully prepared, answered every question appropriately, and showed no evidence of cognitive impairment. Instead of supporting anyone's assumptions, his evaluation completely undermined them. Thursday evening, Vanessa stopped by the main house carrying a folder decorated with cheerful floral patterns. She explained that she had organized household information to make my upcoming legal review easier. Inside were utility statements, insurance papers, and handwritten notes highlighting tasks she believed Daniel could assume in the future. She spoke gently, almost affectionately, describing it as a way to reduce my responsibilities. I thanked her sincerely and placed the folder beside my desk without opening it while she was there. After she left, I examined every page. Nothing inside was inappropriate by itself, yet every suggestion pointed toward the same destination. Less responsibility, less independence, less control. The next morning I dressed in the navy blue suit Henry had always said made me look unshakable. As I fastened the simple pearl necklace he had given me on our 30th anniversary, I caught my reflection in the mirror and realized I no longer felt frightened. I felt prepared. When I arrived at Thomas's office, the conference room door was still closed. Through the glass wall, I could already see Daniel and Vanessa taking their seats, quietly confident that the day would unfold exactly as they expected. Neither of them noticed the thick file resting on the opposite end of the table, waiting to tell a very different story. Thomas waited until everyone had taken their seats before quietly closing the conference room door. There were no dramatic speeches, no raised voices, and no emotional accusations. He simply placed a thick file in the center of the polished oak table and folded his hands. Daniel looked slightly confused. Vanessa remained composed, offering the same pleasant smile she had worn at the gala. Thomas began by explaining that the purpose of the meeting was not to discuss feelings, but to review documented facts concerning my personal affairs, my estate planning, and the governance of Whitmore Construction. He first presented the independent medical evaluations, both confirming that I possessed full cognitive capacity and remained entirely capable of managing every aspect of my personal and financial life. Vanessa's expression did not change, but I noticed her fingers tighten around the edge of her notebook. Next came the records showing that a cognitive evaluation had been scheduled in my name without my knowledge, followed by the correspondence requesting preliminary information related to financial guardianship. Thomas calmly arranged every document in chronological order, allowing the timeline to speak for itself. Then he placed a printed copy of the email Grace had photographed onto the table beside the legal records. No one interrupted. The silence inside that room carried more weight than any argument ever could. Daniel slowly lowered his eyes as he recognized his own name in the correspondence. He admitted that Vanessa had assured him these were only precautionary conversations intended to protect the company if my health ever declined. Thomas acknowledged his explanation, but reminded him that protecting someone begins with honesty, not secrecy. Finally, Thomas opened one last folder containing Henry's final estate amendment, signed years before his passing. My husband had included a carefully written provision stating that any beneficiary who knowingly participated in an attempt to remove my legal independence through deception or unsupported claims would immediately lose every discretionary benefit provided by the family trust. Henry had not written that clause because he expected betrayal. He had written it because he believed integrity deserved protection. The room became perfectly still. Vanessa attempted to explain that everything she had done was motivated by concern, but the sequence of documents told a different story. No one accused her of committing a crime. No one humiliated her. The evidence simply revealed choices that could no longer be hidden behind good intentions. Thomas explained that the trust would now be administered exactly as Henry instructed. Control of the company remained unchanged. Every preliminary guardianship effort was formally withdrawn. All future legal communication regarding my affairs would come directly to me. Daniel quietly apologized, his voice filled with regret rather than excuses. I believed his sorrow was genuine, but trust cannot be restored in a single conversation. It returns only through consistent actions over time. Vanessa said very little after that. She understood that the future she had imagined no longer existed. Several weeks later, Daniel moved into a small apartment near the office while he worked to rebuild both his professional credibility and our relationship one honest conversation at a time. Vanessa chose to begin a separate chapter of her own life. There was no celebration when she left, only a quiet acceptance that every decision eventually carries its own consequence. Grace visited me almost every Sunday afternoon, and together we planted new rose bushes around Henry's garden. Watching them bloom reminded me that families are not preserved by silence or fear. They survive through truth, accountability, and the courage to protect both kindness and healthy boundaries. I never needed revenge to reclaim my life. I only needed patience long enough for the truth to arrive before I spoke.